Thank you for joining us for the Cannabis Quagmire, Accommodations 2017 and Beyond. It's going to be broken up into two sections. You're going to get Cannabis 101, so just a little bit of background about the history of cannabis and how cannabis works. And the second section is going to be workplace readiness. Is your workplace ready? And things that you might have to do in order to get it ready for July 2017. We're going to go through a quick history. We're going to talk about types of cannabis, benefits of cannabis, delivery methods of cannabis, tolerances, testing, and finally, the negative aspect of cannabis, which is addiction. For hundreds and thousands of years, it's been estimated that cannabis has been part of the human history. It has been shown that cannabis seeds have been found dating back as late as 12,000 BC. And historically, in written writings, we've seen cannabis used as medicine as late as 3000 BC. And so it's been around very much in our culture, whether it's spiritual, political, social. And it wasn't until the 1900s where, due to political racism, cultural aspects of society, it was decided to, the 1900s saw the action of the war on drugs, starting with opiates. So opiates was first in Canada taken out in 1908 as an illegal substance other than for medical purposes. Through a number of additional acts in the 1900s, opiates were then completely criminalized, and in 1923, cannabis was added into the criminal code as being an illegal substance. Then in the mid-1900s, cannabis kind of quieted down, and there was only about 2% of arrests due to cannabis. And then a huge, in the 1960s, there's a huge increase in cannabis popularity, where it moved from 20 cases to 2,000 cases to 12,000 cases in a short span of a decade. Then the Canadian government started looking into it in the 70s and realized that there were some medical benefits for it. And unfortunately, it didn't do much from that point on. In the 1980s, cannabis usage stabilized, so it wasn't that surge, but it was still quite popular. 1990s saw a resurgence of popularity. Then in 2000, Regina versus Parker, Parker was an epileptic who couldn't find any other medication other than cannabis to assist him in his symptoms. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to take away medicine from Parker, and we saw the legalization of cannabis in 2000 with the MMAR. Believe it or not, this wasn't the first time the Liberals tried to get cannabis decriminalized. They tried to do it in 2003 and 2004, and both failed. The Conservatives came in and doubled the fines, doubled the sentences of dealers. And then, following the Regina versus Parker, you were able to grow your own cannabis, but it was seen as a health issue that maybe more stringent measures should be taken to protect those individuals. And so third-party providers were able to grow cannabis for medical purposes that had better testing methods and better regulations and oversight on them. So in 2013, you had the licensed producers that were able to produce medical marijuana. 2015, Liberals came in and said, we're going to legalize cannabis. And then just recently, there was announcements made saying 2017, get ready for it. legalization is going to happen. So legalization of cannabis is going to occur in 2018, July of 2018. Now, what you might have seen me use is two words, or one word right now, which is cannabis. So to be more professional, it is recommended to use cannabis rather than marijuana, pot, or weed, because it's like saying, you know, a stubby instead of a beer and that sort of thing. So the idea here is to try to professionalize cannabis and call it what it is. The other thing that you'll see me using is impairment. And it's really recommended that you use the word impairment over high, drunk, intoxicated, because what ends up happening is when you do use high, you're making a judgment or an assumption of that person has taken some kind of drug, whereas impairment just says that not sure what's going on with you, but you don't seem to be yourself. And so what I would recommend is you do use impairment and you use cannabis rather than you're high and you're using weed or pot or marijuana and that sort of thing. So just recently, the Alberta government brought out their framework, and they did a couple of studies which showed that 55% of the Alberta population have tried cannabis. 20% over the age of 17 has tried cannabis over in the last year, and 7% just can't wait to try it. They've never tried it, but they're going to try it as soon as it becomes legalized. The Alberta government has produced a framework, and it's a plan to have a plan in place when it becomes legal. So there's some things here that are still a little bit of unknown, and there are some things that are definitely going to be implemented in July of 2018. They made a great video, so if you can actually just either click on this website or down below in the YouTube description, there'll be a link to this video. And if you can just click on that link and just watch that before the next section, I'll wait. So hopefully you've clicked on that section and you've now got a quick 2-minute overview on what the Alberta government plans. So I'm just going to give you the quick Coles notes. So there's going to be licensed growers that are going to be providing their product over to a provincial government oversight. Though that oversight will then be the distribution for stores. Now, it's unknown right now whether the stores are going to be provincial and government operated or private. There's some controversy. It is estimated that it's going to take about $500,000 in order to get a store up and running with inventory, ensuring that the proper regulations are followed, employee training, and everything like that. And some critics of the government says we do not have enough money to start up, and it's estimated that we would need about 180 stores, retail stores in Alberta for this to go in. And there's a lot of arguments saying we can't afford $500,000 stores of each, or 140 stores each being $500,000 to get up and running. So there's still an unknown on whether it's going to be provincially regulated, but what's going to be known is definitely it's going to be just like liquor stores, where it's just going to be cannabis products sold. There's not going to be a mixture of that. There's definitely going to be no online sales at the beginning, but it's something that they're looking towards. And believe it or not, you can actually go online right now and order edible cannabis online and deliver it to your door. I would not recommend it at this point because remember, it's still illegal. The other issue becomes cannabis cafes and lounges. The way it's kind of, the plan is if you're renting and your landlord says you can't smoke cannabis, just like you can't smoke, so you might not be able to smoke in your residence. You can't smoke outside. You can't smoke in parks with children. You can't smoke in your car. Where are you supposed to smoke? And there isn't places to smoke or ingest cannabis. So they're trying to figure out where there's going to be lounges or cafes or areas where you're going to be able to do that. And you are able to carry about 30 grams of cannabis on you, and I try to, 30 grams is hard to kind of imagine. from what I've seen, it's maybe about 2 packs of cigarettes is about 30 grams of cannabis. But there's a lot of unknowns. So we know that the limit's going to be 18 plus, just like for alcohol and cigarettes, but each province is going to have their own choice. They're still working out with workplace safety to see what kind of things that can be implemented to reduce risk. Driving is a #1 issue. So workplace safety and driving is the #1 concern of pretty much every Albertan. And at this point, and I'll show you later in the video, there actually isn't a way to measure impairment like there is with alcohol of the 0.08 of alcohol. There just isn't a way to see if somebody's truly impaired through cannabis. Like it said in the video, you will be able to smoke inside, not outside in certain areas. However, if your landlord doesn't allow you, that's going to be an issue as well. You're going to be able to grow your own plants, up to 4 per household, but not outside in the garden to avoid it from children. But again, how is that going to be regulated? That's like saying you can only have a 12-pack of beer at your home at any time. So it's going to be quite difficult to implement. And of course, there's going to be very clear-cut areas that you just will not be able to have cannabis on you, but just like you can't be walking around with an open liquor bottle, walking the streets and that sort of thing. But there's still a lot of unknowns. So you'll be able to have 30 grams per individual. If a minor is caught, so 17 years or over, and they have 5 grams of cannabis on them, the police are going to say, stop it, and we're going to tell your parents. If it's going to be more than that, there might be some fines and criminal charges laid for use. And the same thing, just like if you were caught with excessive open alcohol or that sort of thing, it might be fined, or depending on the situation, you might be put in jail, depending on how severe the violation is. 4 plants per household, 18 plus. There'll be licensed producers, we know that much. However, again, whether it's going to be private, governmental, a mixture of that. Same thing with the stores. And then there's going to be some new provisions and training with the police department about impairment while driving. However, to date, there's no way to accurately measure how impaired somebody is. So let's learn a little bit about the cannabis. There's actually a cannabis plant. There's actually 2 types. There's the sativa, which is the high, when people are talking about a head high that they're getting, it's usually the one that they're talking about. It's a lot thinner and taller and than other cannabis plants, and gives you alertness, euphoria, creativity. It gives you that sort of head high, and is best used for daytime use. The other one is indica, and it's more of that where you're getting a tingling in your body rather than your head. And so people use it for relaxation, as a sleep aid, pain relief, and it's really meant more for nighttime use. And then there's a whole bunch of hybrid combinations of those 2. This is a cannabis plant, and what you don't realize is you can eat raw cannabis, and there's benefits from that, just like eating cabbage or green leaves. But until a cannabis plant starts producing these trichomes, this is where the chemical factory production occurs, where a cannabis plant produces these cannabinoids, which are the ones that give you that euphoric high, deep sleep, or impairment. So once a cannabis plant matures to a certain age and starts producing these trichomes, that's where harvesting begins. And so if you look at these trichomes, there's various different cannabinoids in that plant that will give you different sort of intoxication levels or impairment levels that you do. The funny thing is, you can take a plant from Alberta, BC, and Ontario, have the same seed, but depending on how much sunlight, how much oxygen, CO2, how warm it is, what the soil's made out of, there's going to be a different combination of these cannabinoids in the system. Our own body has its own cannabinoids, and these are very similar to our own. And that's why cannabis has such an effect on us, is because these cannabinoids are very similar to the ones that we have in our bodies. And it's sort of the equivalent of a boost into our immune system. And so just like steroids helps our muscles, cannabinoids helps our immune system. So it helps with things such as hunger, it helps with pain, it helps with boosting immune systems, it helps with neurological issues. And so it's really like steroids for your body. Depending on the cocktail of the actual plant, it will have different effects. And this is why it's kind of unsafe for people to grow their own, because they might be thinking that there's a specific combination that plant is producing, but depending on the hybrid, the sunlight, what's in the soil, how much oxygen, what the temperature out there might be different levels. And so THC is the one that gives you that high and that huge impairment. And the funny thing is, over the course of the last 80 years, the street cannabis is what plants have been sort of inbred for, is to have high THC. So you get that huge high on your in your head. And people who took cannabis in the 1960s and now try this cannabis is going to be way more potent than they were used to, because over the last 60 years, producers or dealers have been trying to get a more potent high from these plants. But there's medical benefits for these. So for example, it helps with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, Crohn's disease. It's been known to shrink tumors and post-traumatic stress disorders. So even though you are impaired, it does help with certain symptoms. CBD isn't, is more of a cannabinoid that helps with the medical aspect of it, and it helps with things such as psychotic disorders, chronic pain, depression, diabetes, epilepsy, anxiety, and again, it's been known to shrink cancers. I'm very conscientious of saying that it cures cancers. It doesn't. It helps shrink cancers at this point. But again, we've missed out on about 80 years of research because it's been a banned substance. And so once it's been opened up to the market, it's definitely going to assist in different areas. Another, and I'm just talking about the three most common cannabinoids. There's about roughly, depending who you ask, 60 to 100 of these, and they each have their own little niche that help. So CBC helps with anti-inflammatory, antidepressants, antifungal, anti-tumor, and that sort of thing. But each plant is going to have various different levels of these cannabinoids. So if a producer wants to give you a high, then they're going to try to produce a plant that has high THC. If a producer is going to want to help you with relaxation or deep sleep or different things that they don't want to cause impairment, because you can actually take cannabis that has almost no THC and you're not going to have any impairment, but you're going to have the benefits of CBD, which helps with other medical things or sleep aids and that sort of thing. So one of the problems is that if you're growing your own, you don't know what kind of levels are in that cannabis plant. So I did an okay job, I hope, of sort of explaining why cannabis works on us the way it does, but this video does a much better visual job on how the endocannabinoid system and the cannabinoids in the cannabis plant work with each other. So if you either type this in or click in the comments or click in the description below with that video and watch that video now, it'll do a great job sort of explaining the endocannabinoid system for you. I'll wait. Ready? All right, let's sort of move on. We're going to have a supply and demand problem come July because technically it's illegal right now. So you can't be producing it. But once it becomes legal, everyone's going to want some in on it. It is estimated that right now we can produce about 100,000 tons of cannabis, but we're going to need 500,000 tons of cannabis. So we're not quite there. A big concern is about people that are using medical cannabis right now that's legal. They're really concerned, well, what's going to happen when all of a sudden cannabis becomes legalized? They're concerned that their supply is going to be diminished. And it's estimated that we're not going to be able to balance this supply until about 2020. So just because it's going to be legalized in July of 2018 doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to have an ample supply of cannabis, and my hope is that producers will still have to be required to produce that medical aspect, and it's not going to be taken away. However, there are producers that are saying that are ready to ramp up ×4 what they're producing right now. They have everything in place. Just as soon as it becomes legalized, they're going to ramp up production. But again, it's going to take about till 2020 to meet the supply and demand of it. So the other concern is the black market is not going to be going away anytime soon if this supply and demand doesn't occur. So let's say you walk into the store when it becomes legal. What are your options, or what are your options right now? The most common option is smoking or inhaling, and it's because of the chemical reaction with heat and smoke. It has the most sort of quick and most potent effect because it goes through your lungs. So you'll be able to either smoke it, or just like you have the e-cigarettes, you'll be able to smoke it that way. The most common one, and in my opinion, the one that's going to really take off, is edibles. And so just like you hear about brownies and cookies and that sort of thing, smoking has such a taboo right now that you'll be able to eat and no one will actually know that you're ingesting cannabis. So I really think that edibles is going to be the marketplace, and you're not going to be seeing a lot of people smoking it. And that's another thing that's going to be really hard in the workplaces. Is that cookie that they're having, is that sort of with an ingredient with cannabis or not? Oils. So there are extracts of oils, and this is usually used for sort of pain for shoulders and backs and that sort of thing. Tinctures, which is high concentration, and it's stuff that you sort of put underneath your tongue, and it gives you sort of similar to edibles, but it's just more concentrated. And then tropics or lotions, and again, it's very similar to oils, where it's usually used more for medical purposes, you don't rub it on your forehead or anything like that to get high, but it's really meant more for pain relief and that sort of thing. But these are your 4 most common types of delivery methods. So like I said, smoking or vaping is the most popular one right now because it's the quickest. It gives you the most instant gratification. So onset of taking it, in about 5 minutes, you start feeling the effects, and you peak out about 15 minutes into it, and can last anywhere between 3 to 4 hours of that sort of impairment of it. Edibles, because you're ingesting it and it's going through your stomach rather than through your lungs into your bloodstream right away, it takes about 30 to 90 minutes. The peak effect hits in about 2 to 3 hours. And then 6 to 8 hours into it, or the duration of impairment will last 6 to 8 hours. Very similar for those under the tongue. And again, because it's not going through the lungs directly into your bloodstream, peak effect 1 to 2 hours, and onset 6 to 8 hours. Here's the problem with tolerance. When I was doing this, when I was doing research for this talk, I came up upon a doctor who shared a really interesting story with me that I think really points out to the problem with tolerance. And the problem with tolerance is she had 4 colleagues that went to Amsterdam for a conference. They were all doctors, and they were sitting around in a table and discussing that none of them have ever tried cannabis. And so they decided, you know what, let's see, we're talking about these things, or patients are asking about it. We're here, it's legal in Amsterdam, let's give it a try. And so after dinner, they all sort of took a cannabis dose, and there's 4 of them. One felt nothing, and these are individuals that have never tried cannabis before. So one felt nothing, one felt giggly, one felt that went into psychosis, so very much paranoid, and they never ever want to they never want to touch cannabis again. And the 4th one kind of sort of felt a mild high. And so this is the problem with cannabinoids in general, is they will have a different effect on different people. And so just like right now, if you have 1 beer, you're not going to have one person completely pass out and be zonked out. But you possibly could have that with cannabis, depending on your own body, because of how similar our own cannabinoids are to the plant's cannabinoids. And so a person might go from feeling nothing to feeling a little bit of buzz, a high, very high, gone and going, to a person being completely normal, and you wouldn't even know that you have ingested cannabis. The other problem is the more habitual you are, just like with alcohol and smoking and any kind of thing that you put into your body does a homeostasis and gets used to it. And so, for example, somebody who ingests or smokes a lot of cannabis will be able to take higher doses and still be able to function. And a person who's never used it before, or is a non-habitual or a recreational user, the same amount might put them over the edge and have them completely be impaired. And this is one of the big unknowns and the scary parts about cannabis. It's just, we don't know what effect that specific dose will have on that person versus another person, which makes it very difficult to test for impairment. Dalhousie did a recent study about edibles, and like I said, edibles are going to be the next big thing. It's not going to be about vaping, it's not going to be about smoking, it's not going to be about the oils or tinctures. It's going to be about edibles, because like I said, you can eat and no one will know that you're actually ingesting cannabis. You can take it to the park and eat it and have effects of cannabis without a big puff of smoke and people pointing and being socially ostracized, going, that's a cannabis smoker. 68% of Canadians support legalization. 58 are really concerned about their biggest concern is about the risk to children. 46 are looking forward to purchasing cannabis in edible form. So again, this is why it's going to be a really big thing, whereas people aren't going to be running out to smoke it, people are going to be running out to eat it. And 40% wouldn't mind trying it at a restaurant when given a choice. So for example, imagine the next time you're having your fettuccine Alfredo, and the waiter says, would you like some Parmesan, or would you like some cannabis, or a mixture of both? But people are concerned because they don't know, especially if you've never tried it, what kind of effect that will have on them. And 5% that were questioned were currently using cannabis as a medical aid. So this is the big one, testing. There is no current method to test for impairment. There's various ways of testing it, whether you have cannabis in your system, but not whether you are impaired or not. So for example, there's a saliva test. You take a swab on the back of your throat, and you can test whether you've had cannabis, blood, urine. And there's actually a new thing coming out where the NFL is using this for concussions. And they're trying to implement this into Canada, where you'll be giving a tablet and you'll have to do cognitive quizzes to see whether you are whether you're impaired cognitively. Now, the problem with this is some people do better when they're on cannabis than when they're not. And so it's one of these things that it could be used as a tool for whether you're cognitively impaired or not. But again, it wouldn't be a good marker of whether, how impaired you are. But then some people might fail this completely sober. They're not very good at these games or these kinds of quizzes and that sort of thing. So urine is the most common one, and it identifies that high, that cannabinoid that provides that euphoric high that we are familiar with. When you send it out for testing, it can tell whether you've had it in your system for 7 to 14 days. But again, it doesn't tell you whether you're impaired. It just says that you've taken this in 7 to 14 days. Saliva is interesting. It also does for that high THC one. And it can tell you whether you've ingested it in the last 24 hours or not. But if you take it as in pill form, or believe it or not, there's even suppositories that you can take with cannabis, you can't test for impairment because you didn't put it through to your mouth. So it's one of these things, again, impairment is so difficult to test right now, and this is the #1 fear. The government's going to have a plan in place, and it's going to train police on impairment, but there's currently no real accurate way to test for impairment. Of course, there isn't only good things about cannabis. There's also negative things on cannabis. So the short-term effects are memory loss, coordination, poor judgment, paranoia, and psychosis. Long-term effects, so if you're a habitual user and you're using this on a constant, regular basis, so this might be in short-term in those 6 to 8 hours or that you're using, but the long-term effects on you is cognitive development. There's been a correlation that you do poorly in school if you are a habitual user, or you end up dropping out of school, that you're just cognitively impaired. You're not as motivated, so you want to sit at home, eat munchies, and watch Netflix and chill all day. And then it can create psychosis. Now, both short-term and long-term effects are psychosis, and there's a video that does a really great job on explaining to you what psychosis is, much better than I can. So what I'd like you to do is either type that into your browser, or click down below in the comments or in the description and view that video, and I'll wait, and you'll get a much better understanding of psychosis. I'll wait. All right, welcome back. So we can't talk about cannabis without talking about addiction. And so there is going to be a percentage of the population that goes from recreational to habitual to addicts. But with anything, we are addicted to sugar, we're addicted to fats, we're addicted to video games and other forms of entertainment. And so it's one of these things. The rate of tobacco addiction is about 32%. Heroin is 23% from habitual users. Cocaine is 17%. Alcohol is 15%, and cannabis is 9%. But the interesting part is, if a youth is exposed to cannabis at a young age, that addiction increase turns into 17%. However, the same thing for alcohol. Most addicts of alcohol were introduced to alcohol at a very young age, 12, 11 to 15 years old. So the same kind of statistics with alcohol and cannabis. If you're introduced to cannabis at an early age, the probability of you being addicted is much higher than if you were to try it at 20, 25, 30, 35 years old. Addiction is very complicated, and there's this amazing video on YouTube that I highly that you watch that really changes your perception on addiction. We view addiction as the reason why you're addicted is that because you're putting in chemicals in your body and your body wants those chemicals. But the question becomes, why are we putting these chemicals in our bodies? And the answer is that we put chemicals in our bodies when we're bored, when we're lonely, and when we're isolated. And so please take a look at this video. It's down in the descriptions. Click on the link, and hopefully it'll really change your view on addiction. I'll wait. So wasn't that interesting? That really the reason why people use drugs and alcohol is not because of the chemicals in them, but because they're bored, they're lonely, they're isolated, they don't have a strong social network, they don't have a strong social life. There's something missing in their lives, and they're filling it with drugs and chemicals. And so one of the things that we can do to protect our youth, if we're really concerned about our youth, is that we need to build meaningful relationships with our children. So not throwing them in front of iPads, getting them out there, socializing them, having activities outside of the home, getting them outside, playing with kids, taking interests in their activities, sharing their activities together, having them be a part of a larger community. And not just, we've all experienced these neighbors that their garages open up, they drive in and close and you never see them. But having them be part of the bigger community. So getting involved in school activities, sports activities around the neighborhood. There's community associations that put on Christmas themes in the associations, Halloween themes, that sort of thing, to get more involved and active outside the home. Education and conversations. A big portion of it is educating our youth about the benefits and cons of cannabis, and hopefully for them to make an educated decision to wait until they're 18 years old to try it. Developing other interests, putting them in sports, music, crafts. There's a bunch of post-secondary institutes that have these activities with Legos and robots and dance and that sort of thing, that you just need to get the kids out and involved and keep them busy. If they're busy, they're not going to be bored and looking out for other ways to stimulate their minds. And then extracurricular activities, sports, however, no matter what you do, you're going to mess up your kids. So just do your best, because it's been shown that organized sports, although it decreases the use of illegal narcotics, it does increase the use of alcohol. So you can't win. But the idea here is get involved with your kids, have a meaningful relationship with your kids, because if your kids have a meaningful relationship with you, they'll more likely talk to you, they'll be more honest with you, they'll share their feelings and ideas, and you can have a conversation with them and educate them. And when you isolate a child, or you say there's certain things that you just cannot talk about it in the home, they're going to find out, whether it's through the internet, YouTube, their friends, their peers, wherever, they're going to find out that information regardless. So it's up to you to build meaningful relationships with your children. That are going to come out and either ingest cannabis or smoke cannabis outside the event. And so what are you going to do? Well, one of the things that we have to do for alcohol anyways is provide education about impairment and driving, and that you shouldn't be driving impaired. Provide safe transportation, so taxi cheats or alternative methods for them to be able to get home safely, or you might actually just think about prohibiting the use of cannabis. That's just, in my opinion, it's the same thing as saying, okay, we're going to just serve beer and we're not going to serve hard alcohol. So, that to me seems like a reasonable kind of sort of cut. So you might actually just think, all right, this is new to us. We don't want to deal with this year. So there's not going to be any cannabis use at any after-hours social function and that sort of thing. This is why more and more places have an alcohol-free Christmas party and that sort of thing, and just to avoid this whole kind of quagmire that we're creating for ourselves. So I tried to figure out a really quick and easy way of how to deal with cannabis in the workplace. And so the first question, if a situation occurs about an employee using cannabis in the workplace, the first thing you should ask is there a medical reason why this person is using cannabis? So if the answer is no, and they're a recreational user, you use the disciplinary method. Now, the courts have said that you just can't say, if you use cannabis, you're fired. Because it has to take the holistic, or the situation, the whole situation into account. Factors, situations, position, use, scenarios, risk to other individuals. It can't just be black and white. And so it has to be, the discipline has to be proportional to what the incident occurred. If the answer is yes, it's for medical and they have a doctor's recommendation and a license to have medical cannabis, well then you're going to go into accommodation. The next question, if it's not medical, your next question is then, is there a dependency? So you're going to ask that person, are you an addict? But you're going to put it in a much more softer way. Are you dependent on cannabis? If the person says no, perfect. You're going to discipline them proportionally. If the answer is yes, you're going to provide accommodation, but it's a partnership. So if they say no, you're going to provide discipline and say, if we catch you again, we're going to terminate you. But if they say yes and they want help and they want to go into rehab or get additional help, you're going to accommodate their schedule, their time, and that sort of thing to get them better. Because the problem with addiction is, if you terminate an addict and you throw them on the street, the probability of them continuing to be an addict is almost 100%. It's not that they're going to, you've taken the only assistance they had, which was their employer, to get better. And so it really is up to the employer to step up and to provide an opportunity for an addict to get better and to continue contributing to society. If you terminate an addict without providing them help, one, it's a human rights violation, but two, the probability of them getting better is almost zero. The Alberta Human Rights Commission has done an entire booklet on accommodations and what to do, and so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time, but I do recommend that you go to albertahumanrights.ab.ca and download the accommodations bulletin, and it'll tell you everything about accommodations, duty to accommodate, undue hardships, and that sort of thing. So I'd like you to take a look at this document right now. And again, I'll wait. Take a look at this document, read it through, and then we'll continue so that way I'm not sort of repeating myself. All right. As you can tell from the document, an employer has a lot of responsibility. So not only does the employer have to keep you safe, they also have to follow a lot of legislation that is given out by the government. They have to protect the public and the environment and somehow still be able to make money while doing all that. And this is complicated. It doesn't have to be hard, but it's complicated. And unfortunately, it's one of these things that you think that because it's complicated, it's hard. It doesn't have to be. Driving is hard. Driving is complicated. And it was very hard when you first started. But once you got used to it, now we're texting and driving and not even paying attention. We're zoning out because we took a complex task and we understand its individual process and what we have to do. And it's very similar to sort of workplace accommodation. It's only difficult if you don't have a lot of experience or knowledge with it. If you do have some knowledge with it, hopefully it becomes less intimidating. It's still complicated, but you're able to sort of navigate through. There's things that you can do to avoid or to reduce the amount of risk and the amount of situations that you're going to have. So doing biographical interviews with your employees, so asking them to tell you a history of the last 5 jobs that they had, starting from the oldest job and moving forward. What we tend to do in interviews, we tend to say, okay, tell me your last job, then the job after that, then the job after that. And that's like me asking you, okay, tell me a story, but start with the end, then go into the middle, and then start at the beginning. That's not how we tell stories. So if you can get somebody to start from their oldest job, and rule of thumb is 5, and walk us through how they got to your interview, you might be able to pick up some things about maybe their habits, their usage, the reasons why they were let go and that sort of thing. Do multiple interviews, not just one. We tend to interview somebody for 30 minutes and then make a decision. Bring them in multiple times. Check references, and you're not checking references whether you would, how did they work with others? Are they a team player? Do they respond to stress well? Because usually those are all yes answers. One of my key questions that I always ask is, would you rehire that person? And the answer is absolutely. You have a good candidate. If there's a pause and it's like, well, if we had a position for them that might be suitable, we might look at them as a possible candidate. But what you're also looking for is, did they lie on their resume? So did they lie about their position, how long they've been in a position? Because usually what ends up happening, if somebody has 3 jobs, what they'll do is they'll take out the middle job and they'll add years or months to this job, and they'll add years or months to this job and hide a specific job. So what you're checking for is, did they work for that company? How long did they work for that company? What jobs they had for that company? And what tasks they did. And if those check out, the chances of them lying to you is much smaller than if they lie to you at the beginning. Proper orientations and education about drug use and cannabis use in the workplace is huge. So setting up your clear expectations in your orientations is going to reduce those awkward moments, because you think there's common sense, but there isn't common sense. Common sense only comes with experience and knowledge. And so what you think might be, well, you shouldn't be ingesting cannabis before coming into work, your younger workers might not be aware that that might be inappropriate or frowned upon. Because we're going to have a generation of kids coming into work in the near future that this is a legalized substance just like alcohol is. And I've known a bunch of young kids coming into work intoxicated or very much hungover when they shouldn't. And again, it's just poor judgment in youth, and it only comes with experience. And training and education of your employees, of your managers, of your supervisors, both about cannabis and impairment, duty to accommodate, and those kinds of things. One thing that I do want to talk about performance. Performance isn't, in your employees, performance isn't linear and always on the up and up. It's very fluid. It goes up and down. Some days you perform better than others. Some days you're more motivated than others. However, if you see a performance take a huge nosedive, so it's no longer, it's taking a huge nosedive. There's 3 key core issues that arise that you need to start paying attention to. So the first one is drugs. So you get a good performing employee that all of a sudden takes a nosedive in their performance, chances drugs have entered into their lifestyle. The other one is they're having some personal issues that they're no longer being able to contain in the home, and they're now spilling over into work. And the third one is bullying and harassment. So they're experiencing some kind of bullying and harassment in the workplace. And so those three key indicators you should be looking out for if you see a good performing employee take a sudden nosedive in their performance. So what do we do about workplace readiness? Well, guess what? A whole bunch of companies have done good and bad things about cannabis in the workplace. They've done mistakes and they've done great things, and we can learn from these. Any kind of case that has been made public, you can actually access in the Canadian Legal Information Institute, which is free for anyone. It's canlii.org. Check this out, bookmark it. This is your go-to. And all you have to do is click on it, click on Alberta, and then put in cannabis or marijuana, because marijuana is being used in case law rather than cannabis. And you can see all the various cases that occurred in Alberta using cannabis, and what companies did well and what companies did poorly. So we can learn a couple of lessons, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about some of the lessons, and what I'm going to do is you can look at these in the description, and you can just click on them. I'll make a link available for them. So you can have zero tolerance policies, but you need to have really strong policies and specific reasons why there's zero tolerance. You can terminate people for breaching policies. So not even if there's addiction, if people are breaching policies, if people aren't disclosing that they're users, if they're refusing rehab or an EAP program. If you fail to investigate, you're going to have a huge problem there if you're jumping to conclusions, that you should really focus on the accommodation and not where the impairment's coming from, that you can ask about alternative medication that a person can use, that a safety position is treated very much differently from a non-safety position, that discipline has to be proportional, and that random drug testing is now being upheld, where it wasn't upheld before. So it's one of these things. Check out, I highly recommend reading all these case laws just to get a little bit more comfortable and familiar with these. And we're going to go sort of in depth into these a little bit on point. All right. Policies get a bad name. The way you should think about policies is they're instructions for the future on how to do something in general, because you're not going to be able to write a policy for every single situation that occurs. And so the idea behind a policy is like, if something occurs in this situation, these are the kinds of steps that we should take. So the first thing that you should do, if there's any kind of issue at work, behavioral-wise, substance abuse-wise, or that sort of thing, the first thing you do is you go and you look at your policy and say, what did we say we are going to do in this circumstance? If you don't have a policy in place, what you should start doing is start researching what you should be doing in this place and create a policy as quickly as possible. However, you can't then punish that person for not following a policy you just created. Let's be fair about that. And so the idea here is that what we tend to do is, as soon as we hear a situation, we immediately go and run and deal with it without actually reading up and checking what we should be doing with it. Because if it ever ends up in court, the first thing a judge, a lawyer, an arbitrator, officer, a health and safety officer, a government officer is going to ask you is, show me your policy, because that is the starting point of what you should have been doing, and did you do what you said you would have done? And this is why it's critical to make sure that your policies are clear and that they're instructions of what you would do in certain situations. So duty to accommodate is definitely a key policy that you need to have, and it's required by law. You need to have a duty to accommodate, and so you might as well have instructions for the future of what you do when an employee requires modified duties. You should have a policy on prescription medication that an employee needs to tell you if they're on prescription medication and that there's impairment, and that they need to disclose that there's impairment so that you can then accommodate their impairment, whether it's moving them to a temporary position, changing some roles and that sort of thing. A drugs and alcohol policy saying that you cannot use drugs and alcohol on the workplace in functions that you are representing the organization on company premises or vehicles and that sort of thing, and be very clear about that. Fit for duty, this is now becoming more and more critical, that you are now required to come into work and you're fit and ready to come into work and not coming into impaired. And this is where it's now an important policy that you can terminate somebody and give written warnings for people coming in not ready to work or coming in impaired. Because impairment can mean drugs and alcohol, but it can mean that you took NyQuil and you're still drowsy. That you have a small child and you didn't sleep well because they were throwing up all day and you've only had 2 nights sleep. That's impairment. You decided to watch a Game of Thrones marathon and you didn't go to sleep until 5 o'clock in the morning and your shift starts at 7. All of those things are impairment. So you can write somebody up for coming in not ready to work. And this is where it's one of these key critical policies that come into work, that somebody comes in impaired, might not be for drugs and alcohol, but they're coming in impaired and you're writing them up for not coming into work ready to work. Employee impairment and how to recognize when an employee is impaired. So, slurred speech, stumbling, being clumsy, not making sense, that 20-yard stare that they're not really looking at you, distracted, that sort of thing. And so having a policy and again, instructions of what to do when you think an employee has come into work impaired, how to do proper investigations. And again, this is instructions. We tend to okay, I gotta investigate. This helps you to realize what you have to investigate for. And so the idea here is the reason why a police officer, when there's a car accident, gives you a sheet of paper, is that it is in your own handwriting. They don't ask you to fill out a form online or start typing. They ask you to fill out your statement in your own handwriting to prove that you've written that statement. So one of the things that when you're doing an investigation, it's critical and key is that you get statements from the person that you're investigating, statements from witnesses, and having in handwriting, dated and signed. And that because I've had a case where an employee filled out a statement, sent it to me via email on a PDF document, and when I was in court, I said, did you, so in your statement here, you said, and the employee stopped me and said, I didn't write that. I'm like, what do you mean? You sent it to me. And she's like, no, the manager wrote it for me and told me to send it in. And I had no proof. On the contrary, because I already had the manager set up and say his point, I couldn't bring up the manager at that point. And it's one of those things that if it's in their own handwriting, it's really difficult not to then say, well, I didn't write that thing. So luckily, the judge believed me at that point. But again, it's one of those things that if you really want to reduce the amount of risk in your investigation, interview people, have them write statements after the interview, not just on your own notes. The other thing that I've found was that summaries of investigations or summaries of conversations don't occur or aren't seen as admissible because they're summaries. And so, again, depends on your judge. And the other thing that is useful is we all have cell phones. So what you can do is you can record a conversation. And it's not so much that it's illegal to record a conversation. In Canada, it's only illegal to record a conversation when no one knows the conversation is being recorded. So I can record a conversation of another person. As long as I know that it's being recorded, it's okay. Whether it's going to be admissible in court is another question. But what you can do is you can pull out your phone, hit that voice memo button, and then say, hi, I am here with so-and-so on this date. Do I have permission to record this conversation? And they say yes on the recording. And that way, again, you have proof that you've received that permission verbally. And then termination. Where terminations go sideways is when somebody's terminated by jumping to the conclusions, not hearing the whole side, when termination becomes the first choice rather than the last choice. And by checking on your termination process and policies and procedures, it's a good checklist is, have we done everything that we should have done before we terminate this employee? So these are sort of your key core 7 policies that you should be looking at in the workplace. Accommodations. I'm not going to talk about accommodations in what you should be doing, but ideas of what you can do to accommodate people. So reassign them to a different role, rearrange their duties, so take away some duties and give it to another employee, but replace those duties with something else. So what you don't want to do is all of a sudden, each employee is at 100%. You don't want to take away 20%, and now this person's going at 80 and this person's going at 120. What you want to do is, if you're going to take away some duties, can you pull other duties from other employees to fill those gaps that employee can no longer fulfill? Remove them from safety positions, and this is becoming more and more crucial, that the law is being much more harsher on individuals in safety positions than an individual with non-safety. So for example, this comes back to proportional discipline. If an employee, if a receptionist comes in impaired, they should be treated differently than a crane operator that can possibly destroy, damage, and kill, maim individuals if they come into a workplace impaired. And so there's becoming this much more clearer distinction that we must treat safety-sensitive positions differently than non-safety positions. Allow for longer breaks. So we actually had an employee who was taking 20 to 30-minute bathroom breaks. And we finally called them in and said, hey, you're taking 20, 30-minute bathroom breaks. Is there something that's going on? And yeah, I have Crohn's disease, and I need to take additional breaks. No problem. Provide us medical documentation that you require, not that they have Crohn's disease, but that you require 20 to 30-minute breaks. And then what we will do is you will punch out for those long breaks. And when you don't punch out, we will write you up for taking excessive breaks without actually punching out. They quit 2 days later. Now, if this person truly had Crohn's disease and truly needed those breaks, they would have provided that documentation, would have accommodated them with longer breaks. But again, it's one of those things, you're always going to have employees that are going to try to take advantage. Flexible schedules and leaves. So unfortunately, there are some positions that will require you to be there at a specific time and place. However, if they don't, you can be a little bit more flexible in it. There was a case law where factory company lost a case. There was a single mom that had to work night shift, and she couldn't find babysitting. In the end, she actually ended up having to pay the babysitter more than she was making on night shift. And it didn't make sense. So she went to her supervisor and said, I need to be taken off night shift because I can't find childcare at night for my children. And the employer said, no, everyone works night shift. If we accommodated you, we'll have to accommodate everyone, and there's anarchy, no. And she had to quit, and she sued, and she won. Okay? And the reason why she won was because the employer didn't even try to find alternatives, or wasn't even interested in looking at accommodation. They just said no. So you must look at least whether there's a potential there to accommodate. Allowing employees to work from home. This is becoming easier and easier as technology becomes available. Provide additional training or retraining. And what you have to understand is it is a partnership. Accommodation is a partnership, meaning that you don't just have to, when an employee comes in and says, I have a note and I will dictate what you may or may not do to me. It doesn't work that way. An employer has the final say, and just because an employee requires specific time off at specific times, you can say, okay, you can take these 2 hours off, but you're going to come back and work these additional hours. It's a give and take, and employees that truly need accommodations will appreciate those accommodations, and those employees that are trying to get around the system are going to fight you on it. And if an employee is fighting you on accommodations and it's not and they're not participating, then you can actually terminate them for not participating in their modified duties and accommodations. Because what you can do is you can provide modified duties, and if they're not performing in their modified duties and it's got nothing to do with their disability or impairment, you can terminate them for not doing well their modified duties if they're capable and competent of providing those modified duties. So the employee's needs aren't equal to the employer's requirements and expectations. So it's one of these things that it is a partnership. It's working together, and it's not that whatever the employee wants gets, it's what the employee needs that is accommodated. So I just wanted to throw that out, that the employee does have to participate in the accommodations, and it's a compromise isn't a good term, but it's one of these things that you need to figure out that common ground rather than this is the way it is, because when either side is dictating, nothing good ever comes out of dictating. And people have to be treated fairly. And when people feel that they're not being treated fairly due to their disability or because they need to be accommodated, they get angry. And when people get angry, you cannot have reasonable, rational conversations with angry people. Nowhere in the history of, can you please calm down, has somebody said, gee, thanks for reminding me to calm down, I'm calm now. It just doesn't happen. And so it's one of these things that when you feel a conversation getting heated, one aspect might be that a person feels that something unjust or unfair is occurring to them. And the other thing is you might have to stop and take a day break and continue the conversation the next day. A lot of what occurs is people think that we must deal with this immediately. What you need to do if you have an impaired person, remove them immediately from the safety-sensitive position. But you don't need to immediately deal with that situation if you don't have all that information. If you need to do an investigation, you can send them home on paid leave and until you complete that investigation. A lot of companies make a lot of mistakes by thinking they need to make decisions right away. And so I just want to show you this video because it's a great example of what happens when you treat people unfairly, and it's got to do with monkeys, and you get angry monkeys when you don't treat them fairly. So again, look at the description below, click on that link, and I'll wait for you because it does really add value. Right? So you don't want an angry monkey throwing cucumbers at you. So the idea here is that you want to treat people fairly. You want to accommodate them until the point of undue hardship. The problem is when companies say, I can't accommodate you because of undue hardship, it's very difficult to prove undue hardship. And it's much harder for a company that has 10,000 employees and makes hundreds, millions, if not billions of dollars each year to say that I cannot provide this piece of equipment, this schedule, or these duties to this employer. When it's a small mom and pop place of, let's say, 2 employees, the probability of showing undue hardship on 2 employees of a company of 3 is much easier than a company of 100,000, 10,000, 1,000, 100. And so it's one of these things that just because there is a clause in there of undue hardship doesn't necessarily mean that's your go-to. You really need to show that it truly is undue hardship. So undue hardship can be financial costs, but again, you can't say, oh, we couldn't accommodate this person because instead of making $100 million this year, we made $900,950 instead. That's not going to fly of undue hardship financial costs. So your size and your resources really do matter. If it disrupts somehow your operation, so for example, you have a night shift of 2 employees, well, all of a sudden, 1 employee not being able to work night shift becomes an operational disruption. When you have 1,000 employees and 1 employee can't work night shift, this is where you need to accommodate. It becomes a morale issue of other employees, very difficult to prove. Okay, it's one of these things that it's going to be really tough to prove that your entire your entire shift or company is going to be depressed because of this one accommodation. If it interferes in the rights of others, it's plausible. If you don't have an interchangeable workforce, so an employee just counts, all your employees just count widgets. There's no other job but counting widgets. And this employee now can no longer count widgets. That might be, and you have to create a brand new position. That is seen as undue hardship. But again, it's very difficult to prove because there's very few realistic world life examples where one person, where an organization just does one single thing and all their employees do that one single task. Health and safety concerns, and those are some examples of undue hardship. Prescriptions, and so this goes back to your policies. In your policies, you should have something about a disclosure cause. So if somebody's taking a prescription that could cause impairment, so for example, I wouldn't see that if somebody's taking a prescription on birth control, that they need to disclose that they're taking birth control. But if they're on Tylenol 3s, that cause drowsiness and impairment, I would say absolutely. So one of the things, if it causes impairment, that you would have a disclosure cause that that employee must disclose to the direct manager that they are on prescription medications and what the side effects are. They don't have to tell you what medication they're on, just the side effects and that they are impaired to provide them with modified duties. And again, if they fail to disclose and they've been trained in their orientation that they must disclose, this is where you can write them up for not following policies and procedures. That you will accommodate if they bring up that they are being impaired or that they have a medication for a set amount of time. That they need to tell you the side effects and when they need to take it. Again, I can't stress this enough. They don't need to tell you what they have or what they're taking. But they do have to tell you that they're taking it, what the side effects are, and when they have to take it. So accommodation might be, okay, do you have to take this first thing in the morning? Can you take it in the afternoon when you're going home from work and taking it at nighttime? And they say no, great. Can we get from your doctor that there's no alternative then for you taking it right before you come into work or during working hours? Identify that and being crucial that if you have a safe, sensitive position, that you must disclose impairment, right? And again, it's one of those kind of, you have to look at all factors. A receptionist on Tylenol 3s causes a lot more, less disruption than a crane operator, a heavy-duty mechanic, a driver being impaired. And then the key thing is once they provide you with that disclosure to tell you if they're changing the dosage, if the schedule has been changed, if they're no longer on the medication and that sort of thing. Because again, if they really like their accommodations and they stop taking the medication and they didn't inform you that they're off the medication, you can now write them up for failing to disclose that they're off their medication again. But again, hopefully it doesn't come to that with continuous conversation. Fit for duty is that other critical policy. And it's one of those things that you must disclose that you're impaired. So if you call somebody in, for them to be aware that it is their responsibility saying, I can't come into work right now. I know I was supposed to be on call, but I can't come to work because I ate some cookies or I drank a case of beer or whatever it may be. And now you are writing them up and disciplining them for not following policy, not because of being impaired. And it's a fine line, but again, it's one of those things that it's critically important to be able to distinguish the things. But you do want to encourage employees for telling you that they're not impaired. So I would be very careful about punishing employees the first time that they say they disclose that they're impaired. Educating employees that it's not only from drugs and alcohol, but from sleeping, for taking over-the-counter medication, for not getting enough sleep, from working too hard, working too many hours consecutively, and that sort of thing, can also cause impairment. Clear expectations and timelines of like when you are expected to work for or come in for duty. And there's some companies that have policies that you cannot take alcohol or any kind of substance without kind of 8 hours prior to your shift or after 11 o'clock or something along those lines. So that's something to look at as well. Show genuine concern about the individual safety, that this isn't a policy to have a policy, but it's to keep everyone safe. And you should have and train employees and managers and supervisors on an employee suspicion checklist. So these are things that you can kind of look at, whether they're impaired or not. So if you just Google employee suspicion checklist, you will get a whole bunch of checklists and ideas of what one looks like. The idea here is there is no black and white, but for employees to be aware that they should be reporting themselves and other individuals if they feel or fear that there's impairment in the workplace. Investigations, we kind of touched up on this, so make sure that statements are handwritten, signed, and dated. That you do one-on-one interviews, because when you do group interviews, people will not speak up, or you will start influencing people's memories on incidences that didn't actually occur. You take immediate action, and what immediate action means doesn't mean start firing and making decisions, but if a person's impaired, pulling them away from a safety position, and that might be then moving them into a desk job, putting them on training, having them do paperwork, doing something non-safety sensitive until you figure out what to do with them, whether they're impaired, doing a checklist, that sort of thing, or just sending them home for the day. So you do need to make an immediate action on the investigation part, but not on decisions or terminations and that sort of thing. An option might be a paid leave until you can make a decision. And if you're not ready to make a decision, get more information. And that might be interviewing the people again, looking into case law. But the more information you have about a certain issue, the better decision you can make. And then make a summary of your decision, and the employee has the right to the summary of your investigation, but not to the individual statements, records, or that sort of thing. So it's good to have a summary and provide that employee with a summary, but they don't have access to the evidence because it's a privacy issue with employee witness statements and that sort of thing. And then terminations. And I can't stress this enough, termination should be the last step, not the first step. So where companies get in trouble is when they decide to terminate before investigation, before looking to accommodate, before looking at the undue hardships and that sort of thing. When employers' first reaction is termination, that's where they usually get in trouble. So termination should be the last alternative, that you've exhausted all other alternatives, and now you have no choice but to terminate that employee. So you've exhausted all alternatives, you followed your procedures, and you have to look at your procedures, because you're going to get caught on, well, why didn't you do step C? Well, we didn't think it was necessary. Well, in your policy, it says that you should do step C. Why didn't you do it? And it's things like that get employers in trouble. Before you have that final meeting, making sure that you have all the documentations in place before the termination, not after. So if you're missing something, that you're able to find it, gather it, get it before making that final decision. Respecting the person's privacy, dignity. Do not make an example out of them. Believe me, people will talk. They'll come to their own assumptions and conclusions. You do not need to make it a public incident because you will get in trouble for terminating somebody and causing humiliation to that individual's person or reputation. And then there should be at least 2 people terminating an employee, because ultimately what you want to avoid is that he said, she said, that this person in the interview said X, Y, and Z when it's obviously false. And again, make sure you have your documentation in order, whether it's your policies, procedures, investigations, terminations. Always double check to make sure your documentation is in order, because ultimately in the court of law, people are going to look at witness statement, or people are going to listen to the individuals. They're going to be able to have their say, but ultimately your backup proof and evidence is in your documentation. So always view your documentation as things for the future that people will read, lack of a better sort of terminology. You're really creating this for the future as a future reference. So written requests, restrictions, this is where email is useful. However, what I would recommend is you don't solely go through email, because when you send emails, tones and tones are really misleading or left out. So have a conversation and use email as a summary of that conversation, rather than a sort of back and forth between an employee, because people get heated. There's that paper tiger syndrome, that they will be a lot more vocal or aggressive over email than they would in person. Document all meetings, appointments, because people can get fired for missing appointments, right? So you need to take this time off to go to an appointment. You can call the doctor and say, did employee X show up to this appointment? No. Is there a valid reason why they didn't show up? No, I just didn't feel like it. You can actually write them up for missing appointments and meetings and that sort of thing. This is, again, a difference between you're not addressing the accommodation or modified duties, you're addressing the behavior and not meeting the expectations of the accommodation. Agreements and compromises. So just because you verbally agree to something, make sure you have it in writing, because it also sets a clear expectation on the other side. You think there was agreement, but the person heard something completely different. So this is why it's very important to have all agreements and compromises documented and agreed to. Check up on the plan and follow up. And if you need to make a revision to the plan. A lot of people, where they get in trouble is they have a plan and they have new information that requires them to change the plan and go, no, this is the plan, this is what we're going with. And that's where companies also get in trouble. You need to be adaptable to new information coming in and changing your plans accordingly to new information coming in. Safe, sensitive positions are becoming more important in the eyes of the law, and understanding that, again, a receptionist and a crane operator have two different responsibilities and can cause a lot more carnage coming into work impaired and should be treated differently. And this is kind of the evolving law that's coming in now on safe, sensitive positions. So if a person has a safe, sensitive position, you might need to get a doctor involved in that conversation. Whether the doctor participates or not depends on the doctor. But having a conversation and discussion directly with the doctor might help. And you can talk about alternative uses. Does this person really need to take this piece of medication or prescription? Can they have alternatives? Does it need to be that schedule? Does it need to be that dosage? Now, the doctor has the final say. You don't want to go, well, I Googled and it says that this alternative is better. That's not going to hold up. Whatever the doctor says, but with sensitive positions, the employee and the doctor really should have a responsibility to assist in the adoption of accommodations in the workplace. Asking whether, okay, does the illness themselves that they're taking the prescription fail for them to come into the workplace fit for duty? So is the illness that they're having more the accommodation or is it the prescription? If that sort of makes sense. So asking whether, okay, they're ill, does their illness allow them to come into work fit for duty? And then now that prescription or that medication is making them unfit for duty, but maybe it's the illness themselves, and you might be looking at long-term, short-term disability rather than accommodation. Dosage and schedules, and again, seeing whether those dosage and schedules change, and some dosages take 2 to 3 weeks to kick in. And so this is where it's critically important, where if a person changes their dosage, they might not see the effects 2 to 3 weeks into it, and you being aware that their dosaging is changing. And so what has happened in the past with us is an employee has actually gone on short-term disability for 3 weeks while they're changing their dosage and then coming back after the 3 weeks on the new dosage. And again, it's one of those things that you can't say, well, no, you're fired. It's one of those things that if you can accommodate and it's not causing a lot of disruption, undue hardship, financial losses and that sort of thing because they're on short-term disability on insurance, you should be able to accommodate those individuals. And what specific accommodations are actually required versus what the employee wants. And this is where that doctor conversation is critically important. Whether you get the doctor on board or not, hopefully if the doctor has the employee's best interest in mind and they have a super sensitive safety job, that maybe you would be able to get a doctor involved or at least have access to a conference where a doctor's opinion is there. I haven't had a lot of personal I haven't had a lot of positive, I'm looking for a word here that I'm lacking. So I've heard this being useful. I've never actually been able to convince a doctor to have a conversation with me. But I've heard other HR professionals having a doctor, and that's where it really depends on that doctor, how involved they want to get in their employees' return to work. Putting them on paid leave until you actually make a decision on what to do. Again, moving them to a different position that's not as safe sensitive. And you have an option to send them, an employee has an option to see whichever medical practitioners they want, but you can request that they go see a third-party doctor of your choosing, of the employer's choosing, to get another assessment whether this opinion occurs. Now, what usually ends up occurring, and this is what I hear, is doctors don't like to step on each other's toes. But at least what you can have is whether that employee is accurately telling the doctor about the symptoms and the side effects and things like that. So it is useful, but again, it's very political with doctors. They don't tend to want to contradict one another. There is a bona fide occupational requirement. Again, just like undue hardship, it is very difficult to prove. But for example, if you have drivers, they need to see. So if a driver goes blind, you can say, well, one of the requirements to drive is to be able to see. But these are very difficult. If a person has 15, 20 tasks and they can't do one of them, it's very difficult to then argue that they cannot do this one out of 17 tasks and we now must fire you because it's a bona fide occupational requirement. You do have some rights to some medical access. So again, you don't have the right to the diagnosis, what they have, what prescriptions they're taking, but you can request some medical information, which means, which you can ask, how long is this disability? Is this disability for 6 weeks, 1 year, or permanent? Will that person recover to 100%? Will they recover to 95%? Are they seeing their, are they going to their appointments? Are they missing any appointments? And if they're missing any absences at work, are they due to the illness or due to other factors? And if they're due to other factors, you can discipline for the other factors, not for the medical reasons. Giving the doctor a list of duties that the employee says, and can this employee do these duties? And doing like a physical job assessment or a task list, sending it to the doctor and say, tell me that they can't do these things or tell me which things that they can or cannot do in their jobs. And then is there a specific time duration? Is it like first thing in the morning, in the afternoon, that they're going to have these physical or mental restrictions? Is it for the 8-hour shift, or should they only not be doing this for like 2 hours? Or can they do this for 1 hour a day and that sort of thing? So durations of restrictions. Now, if you accommodate an employee, you should pay them the same. And this is why if you're going to take away some responsibilities, you should fill them with others to give them a full plate to work with. You can reduce a person's wage. However, those duties, those changes need to be significant in order for you to say that, okay, we are now moving you from a crane operator to a receptionist. We can't be paying you $50 an hour as a receptionist. You will never be a crane operator again due to these disabilities. So we're going to retrain you for this. It's very difficult to prove, and I highly recommend that you get legal counsel involved if you're doing those dramatic changes. But slight changes, rule of thumb, 10%, 10 to 20% you're usually able to justify, but a huge drastic cut is very difficult to do that. If you can justify you're experiencing undue hardship, which is difficult to prove. And lastly, what I sort of want to leave you with is you cannot solve the cannabis, accommodation, undue hardship problems through email and telephone calls. The way you solve problems is actually getting together in a room of people and talking about the issue. That's where the ideas, the creativity, the relationships, you can see the disability, you can see the pain on the frustration on a person's face when they're dealing with accommodations that you just can't see over email or over the telephone. I highly recommend when you're talking about these things, you meet in a room and you talk to people and figure out what you can and cannot do, what's going to work, and trying things out rather than saying, no, this is the way it is. So getting people in a room together, getting people together usually make better decisions. And it's it's one of those things with cognitive bias. If you don't like a person, you tend to not like their decisions. But what you have to realize is sometimes they're right, and their ideas are better than your ideas. And so just taking a step back and realizing that the employee might have a better way of them being able to, how they can be accommodated. And one of the questions you should ask is, how would you like to be accommodated, rather than this is the way we're going to accommodate you, because their definition of accommodation might be completely different than yours. Listen to what the other side is saying, because they might be right, and chances are they are right from their perspective. Reach out to your network and ask other HR individuals or practitioners or legal counsel about advice. I have this situation, what should I do into it, if you're not sure of what you should be doing. And then I can't stress this enough. We always feel that we need to make decisions right away, and we don't. If you don't feel comfortable making a decision, you can put it off, not indefinitely, but you can put it off until new information or additional information. So putting a person on leave, giving them duties, scanning, whatever it might be, that you are able to wait out until a more definite. I once had somebody appeal a disability by a provider for 5 months. And it's one of those things that people were sort of telling me we should terminate this employee, but they were going through the appeal process. And it was their right to go through the appeal process. It was an unpaid time. It was nothing to do. There was no undue hardship on our part to wait. And so we waited, and the thing solved itself just through patience and waiting for additional information to come in. And we were able to make a much better decision waiting than trying to make a guess of the unknown with less information. So your plan is going to be this. You're going to come in and you're going to look at your policies and see what tweaks you have to make to your drugs and alcohol policy. And if you don't have any of those 7 policies, you're going to create those policies. You're going to address recreational and medical use in cannabis in those policies. You're going to look at your orientations and introduce cannabis into your orientation strategy. You're going to train employees and educate them about cannabis and impairment. You are going to require disclosure on usage and dependencies and talking about how they need to disclose changes as well. You're going to have a policy requiring prescription as medication and sharing schedules in the amounts. You're going to have a policy requiring a fit for duty and depending on whether a position is safety sensitive or not. You're going to train your supervisors and your workers on observing impairment and impairment in others. You're going to have tools, forms, and checklists to help guide your supervisors on impairment in the workplace. You're going to train and inform your employees about your employee assistance program, both for stresses at home and at work and on dependencies. And then you're going to use various forms to communicate that with your employees. So it might be email, one-on-ones, group orientations, videos, memos, safety bulletin boards. Studies have shown that a person needs to look at a piece of information about 7 times before they actually understand or get it into their sort of repertoire. So sending a single email is not going to do it. You need to consistently over the next year introduce these ideas, training, development, orientations, hiring, in order to really become a cultural aspect in your organization. And then that's it. So hopefully this has given you a little bit on insight both on cannabis, the pros and the cons and what to expect in 2018, and how you can prepare for the workplace. Thank you.